Last week, we looked at, I gave that long introduction, and then we took a look at the biblical sources. This class was designed very purposefully so that we first address the question, where does the prohibition against intermarriage come from? And sub-question number one, does the prohibition against intermarriage come from the Torah? So I wanted to include the sources in the Torah, not that are anecdotal. That is not, Abraham telling his servant Eliezer, don't take a daughter for my son from this or this area or tribe, because that's just in the context of their story. It's not necessarily legislative for future generations. So I only wanted to include laws in the Torah which legislated some sort of prohibition against intermarriage. And I said to you, we learn both from commission and omission. Where do we learn commission? That is, where is it explicitly or in some way mentioned? And you have the source in Exodus and the source in Deuteronomy. The main difference between these two sources is one excludes 6 nations, one excludes 7 nations, but both have this surprising feature of not prohibiting intermarriage in general, not saying you can't marry with anybody from another nation, which the Torah could have said if it wanted to. It says you may not marry from the nations who are native to the land of Canaan or the land of Israel. And we learn also from omission, because something I posited last class is that one would expect the prohibition against intermarriage to be found in the book of Leviticus, in the central section of the book called the Holiness Code, right? The Holiness Code in the book of Leviticus is where we find all the thou shalt nots which relate to sex. And you will not find in that section of the Torah any prohibition against intermarriage. You find a whole bunch of other stuff, but what you would expect to find, you don't find. And so we learn there from omission. So the 2 points I really wanted to emphasize in the class last week are, number one, it is not clear anywhere in the Torah that there is a blanket prohibition against intermarriage. Let me repeat that. It is not clear anywhere in the Torah that there is any blanket prohibition against intermarriage. And number two, a bit more of a, let's say, challenging assumption or point that I'll posit is that the prohibition against intermarriage might be a secondary concern in these sections of the Torah, with the primary concern being the religious fear that such daughters and such sons will draw away, will seduce the Israelite men and women away from their attachment to Hashem. They will bring them to idolatry. Now, it makes sense in this context, doesn't it, that the two are going together. The two ideas that first, we're talking only about the 7 nations native to the land of Israel, and second, that the primary fear is that they'll seduce our sons and our daughters away. Not that there's something implicitly wrong with intermarriage. It's what it will cause. And the two go together because living in the land of Canaan, there's a Girgashite temple over here and a Jebusite temple over there. And so since we're living in a land where these religious cults exist, and if you go to the Israel Museum, by the way, you can see some of the symbols of these different cults that they found, buried over centuries and centuries ago. You see their gods And so we know all the different gods and all the different practices that were worshipped by the different Canaanite nations. And the fear is that they'll somehow get into your home. You see, I'm not worried about the Irish gods making it into your home, because even if you married a girl or a guy from Ireland, it's going to be hard for that girl or guy to find the Irish. They didn't have international shipping where you could ship your idols from Ireland all the way to the land of Canaan. But the local gods were everywhere. So the fear is the local religion, the local men and women. Keep them away from your sons and your daughters. And of course, we reviewed last week an example of intermarriage, the story of King Solomon, who is chastised in the Torah for marrying all of these women, including women from the local tribes. And what do? They lead King Solomon astray, and he starts worshiping other gods, and Solomon and his later descendants, are punished because of Solomon's idolatry, caused by his many intermarriages. That's what the Torah blames. Excuse me, not the Torah. That's how the book of Kings, that's what the book of Kings says in blaming Solomon. So it's almost like the prohibition against intermarriage, even with the 7 nations in the Torah, is not really a prohibition. It's almost like the Torah giving good advice. The Torah saying, look, don't do this. Don't intermarry, because if you do, such and such might happen. It's not that you're not allowed. If it was that you were not allowed, then how could Solomon get away with it? So you're allowed, but we don't recommend it, and you shouldn't do it. It's good advice, rather than what we would call an isur, a clear prohibition. Now, where we left off last week was this interesting source in Malachi, where suddenly the Bible moves away from a prohibition against 7 nations. And I say suddenly because it's not really suddenly, but over time, we now no longer find an intermarriage prohibition in the Bible against 7 nations, obviously because those 7 nations disappear. They don't exist anymore as time progresses. I don't know if any of you know any Jebusites, but they don't exist anymore. They haven't existed for a long time. And in the biblical era, they eventually disappear and assimilate quickly as the Greco-Roman world takes hold in Palestine. And now in the book of Malachi, which is where we left off, we're not worried about the 7 nations, the daughters and the sons of the 7 nations. We're worried about marrying women, I'm quoting to you, marrying women who worship a foreign god. So the 7 nations aspect of this has been removed, but the idea perhaps that the primary concern is of a religious nature, that is not removed. In Malachi still, his anger is at marrying women who worship a foreign god, not foreign women, foreign women whom worship a foreign god. Where we're going to pick up today is in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, just a little bit of background for those of you who are not familiar with the Hebrew Bible. Ezra and Nehemiah are really important books of the Bible that chronicle what we call in Hebrew Shivat Zion, the return to Zion after the Babylonian exile. So you know the Babylonians in 586, I think I got that correct, in 586, destroy the first temple. And for about 70 years, the Babylonians take the Jews captive to Babylonia by the rivers of Babylon. You know the song. There we wept when we remembered Zion. That's what we were doing for 70 years, weeping as we remembered Zion. And Ezra and Nehemiah are the leaders of the group that returns to Zion after the Babylonians are defeated by the Persians. After the Babylonians are defeated, the Persian king allows the Jews to go back to Zion, and Ezra and Nehemiah are rebuilding the Jewish people in many ways in Jerusalem. They rebuild the temple physically, but they're doing much more than that. In the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, they are rebuilding Judaism in many ways. The whole idea of reading from the Torah on a weekly basis, like we still do today in synagogue every Shabbat, originates in Ezra and Nehemiah. They're the ones who say, look, we're in big trouble if all our religion is a temple cult. Because look what just happened. When we lost the temple, we had no more religion. So we need to have a more complex religion that focuses on text, on this book called the Torah, which we've sort of hasn't been at the center. The cult was at the center, but we're going to make that book at the center, and we're going to read it every chance we get. We're going to teach people, because that makes Judaism portable and gives us a bit of defense in case a destruction happens again. It was an extraordinary innovation because, of course, a few hundred years later, a destruction does happen again, and Judaism is preserved because we are a text-centered religion rather than cultic, rather than a particular site of worship. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah comment, let's say, I don't want to give it away, we have to read, but comment on intermarriage in their book. And what I'm going to do now is share my screen with you and ask you, Rona, if you could read for us. Rona, is that okay? Okay, let's pull up the share screen. Can you all give me a thumbs up if you can see the screen that I'm sharing with you? So this is chapter 9 of the book of Ezra. And Rona, you know, I interrupt frequently. I'm not doing it to be rude. I'm doing it to explain. Okay, everybody follow along with the passage that is currently on your screen. Go ahead.
After these things had been done, the leaders came to me and said, "These people of Israel, including the priests and the Levites, have not kept themselves separate from the neighboring peoples, and their detestable practices, like those of the Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians, and Amorites."
So the leaders are quoting a law in the Torah. The leaders of the people come to Ezra and say to him, not just the regular folk, but even the priests and the Levites, in other words, the elite, are doing things a little bit too close to the neighboring peoples with their detestable practices. Now, in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, the Amorites, it's not clear that any of them existed. Probably they did not. But it's almost like they are symbolic, these nations. The Torah uses them as symbolic for any people who are dwelling near you, who are engaged in a sort of what the Bible calls detestable practice, right? What we just read is detestable practice. But what do we think that means, detestable practice? It probably means idolatry. So they are upset because with this Shivat Zion, they're returning to Zion. We've been away and held in captivity, and we come back to freedom. And suddenly, all of the priests and the Levites, what are they doing with their newfound freedom? They're going on their smartphones, on Tinder, and finding whatever women and men are available, and they're dating. And let's keep reading, Rona, because here Ezra documents even more what's going on.
They have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons. They have
sorry, that's
and
a
have mingled the holy
sound effect.
race with the peoples around them. And the leaders and officials have led the way in this unfaithfulness.
Let me stop you. There's words here that we've never seen before. They've taken some of their daughters as wives and their sons. Okay, that we've seen before. They are intermarrying. But what is this? They have mingled the holy race with the peoples around them. All of you underline those words. If you have this printed out, underline those words. Let me use my little text feature here and highlight this. The holy race with the peoples around them. I'm going to ask a question. I'm not going to give you an answer. We'll save it for discussion. What does Ezra mean when he says the holy race? What is different about this passage than what we have seen before? Does that add something to the prohibition? I think it does. It adds something that we've never really seen before. The idea that in Jewish blood, there is something special that ought to be preserved, sanctified, kept separate. And through those marriages with your sons and daughters, the holy race becomes desecrated. We've never seen this before. But as I said, Ezra and Nehemiah, they're changing things. There are layers of Judaism that they take away and layers that they add. I think you might be seeing one of those layers here. Okay, go ahead, Rona.
And the leaders and officials have led the way in this unfaithfulness. When I heard this, I tore my tunic and cloak.
Yeah, what does that mean? When do we tear our tunics, everybody?
In mourning.
That's right. It means he's in mourning.
Pulled hair from my head.
Anyone here ever heard of the practice? Sorry, Rona, I keep interrupting you. Anyone here ever heard of the practice of sitting Shiva when a son or a daughter intermarries?
Yes.
You just saw, well, now you all know where it comes from. Right? This does not say, and everybody should tear their tunic when their son or daughter intermarries. It's just saying, Ezra, when it happened to him, when he saw it going on, that's what he did.
Pulled hair from my head and beard and sat down because of this unfaithfulness to the exiles.
Sorry, you skipped one line. And sat down appalled.
Oh, and I'm sorry, and sat down appalled until the evening sacrifice. Then at the evening sacrifice.
Right here, where I am.
I'm sorry.
Then everyone.
Yeah. Then everyone who trembled at the words of the God of Israel gathered around me because of this unfaithfulness of the. Then everyone who trembled at the words of God of Israel gathered around me because of this unfaithfulness of the exiles.
So everybody who trembled at the words of God, that's not talking about prophecy, right? When Ezra talks about the words of God, he's talking about the Torah. For Ezra and Nehemiah, the Torah regains or gains, depending on which historian you speak to, a central role in the practice of a Jewish religion. And Ezra basically gathers all the people, the most religious people around him, those who tremble at the words of God, because he's so appalled by what he sees. And I sat there appalled until the evening sacrifice. And he couldn't even speak when he heard what was going on all day. Then
at the evening service, I rose from my self-abasement with my tunic and cloak torn and fell on my knees with my hands spread out to the Lord my God and prayed. I am too ashamed. Every time you move it, I have
Sorry,
trouble.
my
I
fault.
am
I'm
too
too ashamed
ashamed
and
and
disgraced.
disgraced by my God to lift up my face to you, because our sins are higher than our heads, and our guilt has reached to the heavens.
Look
From
at
the
this. Look at the words that he uses. This is all new. I mean, everything we've seen before. It's been a couple of sentences. Don't take wives from here, they'll lead you astray. Don't take sons from there, they'll lead you astray. But Ezra is a wreck. He's a wreck over this. He can't even speak. He's completely covered in shame. He can't even turn to God in prayer. He's hiding his head.
From the days of our ancestors until now, our guilt has been great. Because of our sins, we and our kings and our priests have been subject to the sword and captivity, to pillage and humiliation at the hand of foreign kings, as it is today. But now, for a brief moment, the Lord our God has been gracious in leaving us a remnant and giving us a firm place in his sanctuary. And so our God gives light to our eyes and a little relief in our bondage. Though we are slaves, our God has not forsaken us in our bondage. He has shown us kindness in the sight of the kings of Persia. He has granted us new life to rebuild the house of our Lord and repair its ruins. And he has given us a wall of protection in Judah and Jerusalem. But now, our God, what can we say after this? For we have forsaken the commands you gave through your servants to the prophets when you said, the land you are entering to possess is a land polluted by the corruption of its peoples. By their detestable practices, they have filled it with their impurity from one end to the other. Therefore, do not give your daughters in marriage to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons. Do not seek a treaty of friendship with them at any time, that you may be strong and eat the good things of the land, and leave it to your children as an everlasting inheritance.
So, what a sermon. What a sermon. This is a prayer. Ezra is screaming out to God, saying, God, we know we've been lousy. We deserved to have the Babylonians come and destroy our temple and be taken into captivity. And for one small blip in history, you've been gracious to us. You've been kind. You've given us a new king in Persia who's allowed us to come back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And look what we've done with our freedom. We have gone and married the very people that you in your Torah commanded us not to. Now, I would be saying to Ezra, hold on. God didn't say not to marry the people who are living in the land. He said, don't marry these 7 nations. But Ezra's perush, Ezra's interpretation of the Torah, is that God wasn't forbidding these 7 nations. God was forbidding intermarriage with any nation, right? This is like Malachi, like we saw in the earlier source. It's not the 7 nations. It's any people who are engaged in detestable practices that live among you. That's Ezra's interpretation. Any people who live among you engage in detestable idolatrous practices, and he uses that word impurity, which we've not seen before, but it relates to what Ezra said earlier about the holy race. Pollution, impurity. They've impurified the land, and now they're going to impurify us too. This is an extraordinary chapter in the book of Ezra, where he cries out to God with tremendous aggravation and fervor and pain about what he sees transpiring. that people are not observing. It's not Shabbat, it's not Kashrut. What are they not observing? It's the laws of the boundaries, right? Intermarriage with the people living among them, and making treaties, right? Intermarriage is sort of related to making treaties because it's saying we can live together in harmony. And that really touches him deeply, Ezra, aggravates him deeply. Keep going, Rona. One last paragraph here.
I can't see exactly where we left
What
off.
has happened to us
What has happened to us as a result of our evil deeds
is a result.
is a result of our evil deeds and our great guilt. And yet, our God, you have punished us less than our sins deserved and have given us a remnant like this. Shall we then break your commandments again and intermarry with the peoples who commit such detestable practices? Would you not be angry enough with us to destroy us, leaving us no remnant or survivor? Lord, the God of Israel, you are righteous. We are left this day as a remnant. Here we are before you and our guilt, though because of it, and not one of us can stand in your presence. While Ezra was praying and confessing, weeping and throwing himself down before the house of God, with a large crowd of Israelites, men, women, and children gathered around him, they too wept bitterly.
So this was such a powerful sermon that people started to gather around Ezra, and they joined him in his lament.
You're muted, Rabbi.
I'm muted? Can't hear me?
Your volume is very, very low.
Oh, my volume is low?
Yeah, it just went out for some reason.
That's strange. I'll change my microphone here.
Is this a little bit better?
Yes.
Okay, we'll try this mic.
Should I continue?
Yeah, did everyone hear me when I said the people? Now this is important because the people start gathering. It's like a powerful sermon that brings all the people together. They're so compelled by Ezra's prayer that they cry with him. Then Shechaniah,
Shechaniah, son of Jehiel, one of the descendants of Elam and Ezra, we have been unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women from the people around us. But in spite of this, there is still hope for Israel. Now let us make a covenant before our God to send away all these women and their children in accordance with the counsel of my Lord and those who fear the commandments of our God. Let it be done according to the law.
so thank you, Rona. So how does this all end up? At the end, the people take upon themselves a brit, a covenant. And this covenant is that they will divorce, it seems, all of the non-Jewish men and women that they have intermarried with, and then there will be hope. Now, the sad part is the sending away the children too. But I guess the fear is that, oh, by the way, it's not the men and women. It just says women, all the women and the children. Now, I'm not sure why. It could be that that was much more common, that the Jewish men are taking the foreign women. But perhaps there was a fear that those foreign women would have had influence on the children, and therefore we need to separate both from these women and their children. And it would be unfair, obviously, for us as husbands to keep the children and just send the women away. So you can have your thoughts, I certainly do, about the justness of this covenant that they take among themselves at the end of the day. But I think the real point here is the only solution, according to Ezra, is preserving this Zera Kodesh, this holy seed or this holy race, by breaking with these non-Jewish women, and the people take this upon themselves in the times of Ezra in a communal way. Together they take upon themselves this covenant. Now there's one more idea here that I think is worthy of thought, at least in my opinion, worthy of reflection. That is this powerful word, remnant. Remnant. If you could highlight that word or underline it. Ezra introduces a concept that is going to be very powerful. He doesn't know, but centuries and centuries later. What he's saying could be a speech that someone could give after the Holocaust. Imagine. You could take these words and just put them into 1950 and they would fit perfectly. Ezra says, we are so fortunate to be alive. We don't even, because of what we did, we don't even deserve to be alive after everything we've been through, what the Babylonians did to us, what captivity did to us. And now look at us. There's just a small remnant around. And what are we doing? We're intermarrying with the other nations. What's that going to do to the remnant? And this is the first time where I think among all the sources that we've reviewed, the first time where this idea of prohibiting intermarriage becomes intertwined with the idea that the Jewish people are small and insignificant and in constant danger of disappearing. That's to me what this word remnant might mean as Ezra uses it. Now here I think he's saying God might be in his right to leave no remnant behind. That is, he's seen what the few of us who have returned have done. God is probably regretting the whole thing and saying, I should have just let them all die out in captivity because the ones that I've left alive have forsaken so much. But one could use the same argument to say, we're so small, we're so insignificant, there's such few numbers of us. The decisions we make as individuals have a large impact on the continuity, on the future of the Jewish people. We don't have the luxury of the other nations, which number in the tens and hundreds of millions, where I, as an individual, can separate my personal preference from the well-being and the destiny of the community. When you have hundreds of thousands of people, your decision doesn't have a big impact on the rest of the group. But when you're a remnant, when you're small in number, insignificant, your personal choices can have a major influence on the future. And I think Ezra introduces that idea in a different context than the modern one, obviously, but introduces that idea, and that is extraordinary because we're reading a source now. Ezra is at least 2,500 years old. 2,500 years ago, you had the leaders of Israel saying, we're so small, we can't afford to intermarry. We're going to lose our kids. And crying and giving this extraordinary sermon over the situation. He is not, again, crying over Shabbat, over Kashrut, over keeping any of the 613 laws in the Torah. This, it's not even clear, is a prohibition in the Torah. And yet this is what gets Ezra in this state. It is this remnant that is abandoning their loyalty to preserving, their loyalty and their preservation, their duty to preserve what has been left after experiencing exile and trauma and subjugation. You have a duty, you failed in the duty, and that's his speech. To me, extraordinary. Nehemiah, from the same era, picks up on Ezra's lament about intermarriage. And now we're going to read Nehemiah's words. So thank you, Rona. Gloria, you're next on my screen. Can I ask you if you would help us read the source from Nehemiah chapter 10?
Certainly. Those who sealed it were Nehemiah the governor, the son of Hakaliah, our Levites and our priests. The rest of the people.
Remember, there was this covenant. Ezra talks about this covenant. What was his covenant? That the Jews, the Jewish men who had married foreign women who were worshiping foreign gods, that they would divorce them and also send their children away. That was the covenant in Ezra. Now, there was something lacking in that covenant, right? Which is, well, what are we going to do going forward? We know what, right now what we're going to do, but what about in the future? So Nehemiah introduces the covenant that the people make in chapter 10 of the book of Nehemiah, the covenant that people are making in his day. And lo and behold, what is included in this covenant? So first of all, we have a list of everybody who signs up for this covenant. Nehemiah, the Levites, the priests. Keep going, Gloria.
The rest of the people, priests, Levites, gatekeepers, musicians, temple servants, and all who separated themselves from the neighboring peoples for the sake of the law of God, together with their wives and all their sons and daughters who are able to understand. All these now join their fellow Israelites, the nobles, and bind themselves with a curse and an oath to follow the law of God given through Moses, the servant of God, and to obey carefully all the commands, regulations, and decrees of the Lord our God. We promise not to give our daughters in marriage to the peoples around us or take their daughters for our sons.
That there is explicitly the covenant that is made in the days of Nehemiah with all of those, and this is an important phrase here that I want to bring your attention to, all those who separated themselves from the neighboring peoples for the sake of the law of God. So this is almost like a second Matan Torah, a second delivering of the law. It's like a second Mount Sinai. And Nehemiah gets everybody together and says, look, we need to rededicate ourselves to the law of Moses. And when I say, by the way, rededicate, to me, it means it's not just rededicating ourselves to the law of Moses, it's rededicating ourselves to Nehemiah and Ezra's version of the law of Moses, which sometimes accords with what we might have expected to say back in the biblical time. And sometimes it's different. I think in this regard, it is different. It doesn't say in the Torah that you can't give your daughters in marriage to the peoples or your daughters for their sons. It doesn't say that. It talks about the 7 nations. But a blanket prohibition does not exist. But in Nehemiah and Ezra's version of the Torah, that's what it means. It means no intermarriage, period. And Nehemiah asks everybody to obey that covenant. Keep going, Gloria. Just we're a couple more sources in Nehemiah that I think are interesting. On that day, the book of Moses was read aloud. Remember, I said Ezra and Nehemiah were the ones who instituted the reading of the Bible as part of the regular practice of the Jewish religion. So here he comments.
On that day, the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people, and there it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God, because they have not met the Israelites with food and water, but had hired Balaam to call a curse down on them. Our God, however, turned the curse into a blessing. When the people heard this law, they excluded from Israel all who were of foreign descent.
So isn't that interesting? It's almost like this is extra evidence that the people were really unfamiliar with what was written in the Torah. We imagine that in the times of the Bible that everybody knew the Torah off by heart. It's not true. Ezra and Nehemiah are concerned with people's ignorance of the law. And that's why they institute the regular reading of the Torah. And it's almost like here, the people are realizing, oh, I didn't know that the Torah said you can't have Ammonites or Moabites among us. Well, what did the people do when they heard that? They excluded from Israel all who were of foreign descent, right? Now, just think here, what does that mean, excluding people who are foreign descent? Does that mean the children of intermarried families? Are they of foreign descent? Does it mean, people who thought they were Jewish, but actually never converted? It's not totally clear. But Ezra and Nehemiah, I think here are going deep into this idea of there being Jewish blood, a Jewish race, a Zera Kodesh, a holiness to Jewish people, and we need to separate from those who don't have that blood. Okay, and just one more passage from Nehemiah.
Okay. Moreover, in those days I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod or the language of one of the other peoples and did not know how to speak the language of Judah.
In other words, they had assimilated so much. Their mothers had such a greater influence on these children than their fathers that they didn't even speak Hebrew. They only knew how to speak the language of their mother.
Right. I rebuked them and called curses down on them. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, you are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves. Was it not because of marriages like these that Solomon, king of Israel, sinned? Among the many nations, there was no king like him. He was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel, but even he was led into sin by foreign women. Must we hear now that you too are doing all this terrible wickedness and are being unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women? One of the sons of Joada, son of Elishib, the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat, the Horonite.
Yep.
And I drove him away from me. Remember them, my God, because they defiled the priestly office.
One of the sons of the high priest intermarried. That's what he's saying, right?
Oh, right.
Even one of the sons of the high priest, and I drove him away.
Remember them, my God, because they defiled the priestly office and the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites. So I purified the priests and the Levites of everything foreign and assigned them duties, each to his own task. I also made provision for contributions of wood at designated times and for the first fruits. Remember me with favor, my God.
So who's in charge? Are the high priests in charge of things in this period of the Second Temple? It doesn't sound like it, does it?
No.
It sounds like Nehemiah is so disgusted by the behavior of the priests and the Levites that he takes over, gets rid of everything foreign. I assign the priests the duties that I want to assign them. And this is an interesting passage because it is the beginning of the rabbinic assertion of power over the powers of the priests and the Levites, which in the first temple period was clearly the superior power, right? What is it that leads Nehemiah to lose faith, to lose trust in the priests and the Levites? Gloria, what is it?
Well, he just said in the paragraph there, his very son, a son of a high priest, went and intermarried. So what kind of an example are you setting for the people?
Exactly. That these, because they're hereditary positions, you don't necessarily have the best people, the people who are the most committed to following the Torah. You don't necessarily have those people running things in that high office, right? These hereditary positions can be abused. You can get the wrong people in there. And so Nehemiah takes over and says, the Torah now becomes supreme. And with the supremacy of the Torah, we emphasize this rule of separation between Jews and non-Jews. And when you hear, part of why I wanted to read this and not just mention, Ezra and Nehemiah also talk about this, but I think it's so important that we read it, is because the language here is particularly powerful. The exhortations, the prayers, remember my God, the sense of anguish and pain of Ezra and Nehemiah at watching what this remnant is doing with their newfound freedom. I don't think that could be adequately summarized by a teacher. It has to be read. And contrast this, by the way, with the 3 or 4 verses in the books of Exodus and the books of Deuteronomy. Contrast that, where you don't hear much pain or emotion or feeling in the Torah when the Torah talks about marrying foreign women. It's sort of like you shouldn't do it because they're going to lead you astray. But you don't hear this kind of sermon, this kind of pain in Moses's voice or Aaron's voice or any of the other leaders in the Torah. Perhaps, and I'm only suggesting this, but perhaps what changes is that in the time of the Bible, the Jewish people are more confident. We're about to inherit the land. It will all be ours. We'll get rid of all the people. We will have sovereignty, which eventually they did have. We will have sovereignty. We will have a capital. We will have Jewish self-government. But by the time Ezra and Nehemiah roll around, they have seen what history has done to the Jewish people. They have seen the power of the larger nations, of the Babylonians. They've seen captivity. They've seen subjugation and slavery. And by now they see we're in danger. We don't have the confidence that we used to have. And in that kind of environment, if we don't take this law against mixing more seriously, we're going to disappear and we're going to anger God. Now, still I ask, it's still plausible that I ask, is the primary concern here intermarriage, or is the primary concern the loss of Jewish identity? Or I add something new, Jewish identity is the wrong word. Nix that.
Yeah.
Let me start again. Is the primary concern here intermarriage? Or is the primary concern here the loss of Jewish religious integrity, A, or B, the loss of something called, that Ezra calls, let's go back up to Ezra. In Hebrew, we call it Zera Kodesh, but Ezra in Hebrew calls it the holy race. Is it the loss of something in the blood. Now, I'm introducing that here, or I might want to push this a little bit, because it seems to me that both in Ezra and Nehemiah, what really bothers them, it's one thing that the regular Jews are taking foreign women, but what is it that really bothers them? The priests and the Levites taking foreign women. Now, who cares? Why should it be worse that the priests or the Levites are taking foreign women? Well, the priests and the Levites are preserving double holy race, double holy blood. And that's what maybe is driving Ezra and Nehemiah up the wall. We're just a remnant, and they are the remnant of the remnant. They're the remnant of the priests and the remnant of the Levites from among the remnant of the Jewish people, and even they're taking foreign women. Wow, that is not something we can stand for. So we now have this other element introduced in this discussion, that there is something holy about being Jewish. Within your DNA, within your blood, that needs to be preserved. Where is that coming from? Why do Ezra and Nehemiah feel that that is important? And I'll add, how does that make you feel? How does that make you feel? Okay. Why don't we see, we could get started with the Second Temple sources, but why don't we leave that to next week? The next group of sources are written by the time after Alexander the Great, when the Greco-Roman world becomes, or the Greco-Roman point of view becomes dominant in the land. And we're going to see in those sources how they speak about intermarriage, what happens in the Second Temple period when you have the Greco-Roman culture, which really embraces the individual, no matter which tribe or which ethnicity he or she comes from, right? That's the big story of Hanukkah. The story of Hanukkah is the arrival of the Greco-Roman world, which tries to eliminate the boundaries between peoples and build one big multinational empire. So we're going to read sources all the way from the book of Jubilees and Josephus up to the New Testament. You know, people Jews don't always remember that one of the best resources we have for understanding Second Temple Judaism is the New Testament. So we're going to read from Paul and what he has to say about intermarriage. Okay.